What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you what is likely to be a short and sweet review after 100% for Blood West, a stealth FPS set in a supernatural imagining of the American Wild West that sees us battling all sorts of horrors and bizarre creations as we fight the evil spreading throughout the land. Before we dive into all that though, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers, and while that does include the achievements, it includes a lot more than that as well. My Steam profile is linked below, as is a video explaining everything I go over as well if that's of interest to you. Though in the case of Blood West, it's a relatively tame game. 100% on this is likely going to take you 20 to 30 hours at most, depending on how the no death runs for a couple of the chapters work out for you, which is really the only difficult thing about the 100% on this one. But to dive right into it from there, Blood West was in early access for quite some time, but saw a full official release back on December 5th, which was a slightly busy time for me, so I had to take care of a few other things before I could dive into this one. But Blood West spent that time in early access, refining its systems, expanding on content, and really boiling down the things that make their game interesting and unique to play, which is its stealth FPS gameplay. Now, on one hand, you can definitely approach this game from a variety of different directions and approaches, a guns blazing route, if you will, using items, consumables. There's a few different builds you can take advantage of, but the primary purpose of the game is stealth FPS, as your main character can be a little bit fragile, and the horrors you are facing are numerous and respawning. So I think what makes this game especially fun to play is a combination of exploration and the inherent danger of trying to fight your way through these enemies or perhaps just sneak around them instead. And when it comes to that actual gameplay portion, I think the game does great, but falls apart in other places like the story, which we'll dive into over the course of this review. But to start things off with a note on the technical side of things, I personally had basically zero problems running this. I have read some reports of other people encountering more serious bugs or issues actually running the game, but the only thing of note that I had any trouble with at all is that one time when I booted up the game on my PC, it would stutter a little bit, and I just had to restart the game, and that seemed to fix it, but that was about it. Though, I have read some reports of people having issues with saving and exiting at certain points, causing certain breaks in quests, things like that are maybe worth paying attention to if you're concerned about it. Otherwise, though, it ran great. Now, from there, let's talk about the story of this title. The story of Blood West is admittedly a little bare bones, though it is an interesting enough premise. We play an undead gunslinger who is brought back to life after, of course, dying at some point by an amalgamation of souls who set us upon finding the curse at the root of the land's problems. And that story is told over the course of 3 different chapters, and while the story does get a little bit interesting, it is very tame. It never really goes anywhere in terms of character development, things like that, as it largely just serves as a vehicle to get you into these areas and moving through them with a clear purpose and objective. And while that would be fine on its face, I think what little the game does do to interest you in what is happening in the story falls apart right at the end with what I can only describe as a really terrible ending. So while the game's focus was never really on the story itself anyway, if that is of interest to you, I would curb your expectations in that regard. The general plot is decent, but the ending is a real letdown. Which brings us to the next part of this review, which is going to be about progression, gameplay, and the world at large. We're going to roll a few of these in together, as this is a pretty simple game in terms of gameplay, progression, etc. As we don't create a character or anything, we are the undead gunslinger. However, as we engage and fight off enemies, complete quests, etc., we will be gaining experience. And leveling up alongside item progression forms the bulk of how you're going to build your character. Perks are pretty straightforward. Every time you level up, you get 3 skill points. You can spend them on the various perks available to you, though I would highly recommend Gold Prospector and Strong Back to start with, as this will increase your inventory size and also make the economy more in your favor, thus giving you a surplus of cash to spend on things like weapons, ammo, or anything else you might need. Which I tell you because the perks are pretty heavily weighted. There's only 1 or 2 of them I I wouldn't consider being useful much at all, but many of the perks do have substantial changes to the way gameplay and combat plays out. Though without really grinding or anything like that, you're likely to get about 2/3, give or take, of the skills available anyways over the course of the game's 3 chapters. Now the other portion of progression here is the items. You will find a variety of just general weapons, revolvers, pistols, shotguns, sawn-off shotguns, lever-action rifles, larger caliber weapons, melee weapons, etc., etc. The ranged weapons in particular come with a variety of ammo types, etc., and all of that plays into how your character works functionally. Perks are going to make you good at individual things with either melee or ranged weapons, perhaps both, and then the general equipment obviously is part of that, but much of that equipment can come in variations of unique weapons or items that offer special effects. And many of these are tightly designed to work together. For instance, there's a variety of boos you can find out and about in the world that will of course have various status effects that it will place on you when consumed, and there is a weapon in the first act of the game that conveys bonuses when your character is drunk, as an example. And there's also perks that play into that. Another thing you could do is take the perks that give you boosts to your melee bonuses, including one that gives you more damage the lower your health is, and combine that with weapons that deal more damage when your health is low. So much of the progression systems of the game involve sort of either trial and erroring your way through this or simply combining them in intuitive ways until you find a playstyle and build you're comfortable with. Though one thing I do think the game does very well is combine all of those elements in a way that feels natural, but is still able to be approached from any method you might choose. Now, the one downside to this, I think, relates to how the world works. Now, as I mentioned, the game is broken down into 3 separate chapters. Each of these chapters, a standard sort of deserty area, a swamp, and then later a forest, all have various enemies associated with them that have different, of course, equipment, effects, health even, and the thing about all your weapons and everything is that there is damage numbers associated with them. And while it's not really noticeable in Act 1, once you jump into something like Act 2, where the difficulty of the enemies ramps up quite a bit, you need to almost immediately switch over to a better tier of weapons, alongside using the appropriate ammo type against certain enemies to deal any amount of effective damage. And I'd say that transition period in between those acts before you kind of get geared up is probably where I noticed the pacing of progression just feel like a little bit off, especially for a game that's probably only going to run you like 15 to 20 hours, as that leads into combat and some of the other core game mechanics. Now, I want to start combat off mentioning this. Whenever you die, the punishment for that, if you will, is that you pick up soul flaws. Die 3 times and these turn into a curse. A curse will have a substantial detriment to your overall character stats, massively cutting into your stamina, your experience gain, your health, things like that. So if you're struggling with the game has the habit of making that worse, which can be compounded by, for instance, not being able to find a weapon that deals suitable amounts of damage. And I think that combination of elements can lead some people to frustration if you're not willing to power through those moments or become more acquainted with the game's systems and things like that. Because in terms of combat, you do actually have a lot of options. The build ideas I mentioned earlier as an example, but basically combat is stealth FPS for the most part. However, you're free to use consumables, items, weapons, etc. in whatever way you can come up with to deal with certain enemies. Now, one major drawback right here towards the beginning of this section is that enemies cannot jump or climb ladders or anything, which means if you're having trouble, basically everything is easily cheesed by finding the high ground. Some enemies will throw things at you, but those are of course pretty easily dodged, which is helpful to know because, as I mentioned, your character for the most part is pretty fragile. Most enemies can kill you in just a couple hits, as they are of course big monstrosities and you are but an undead guy. And when you die, all those enemies will have the potential to respawn. It's a little inconsistent about what respawns in between deaths, but that is something that happens, and you can actually force that to happen by going and resting at one of the rest areas of the game, but that has the caveat of healing you up to full health without cursing you in some way. Now, a big component, if you will, of approaching individual enemies is, of course, what type of enemy are you facing, as every enemy does have certain weaknesses, which is usually things like certain ammo types or fire, which will make sure that you're dealing maximum amounts of damage to it. And given that you want to kill things as stealthily as possible, that is of course quite important, as you want to make sure whatever you hit actually goes down to begin with. Otherwise, however, combat is basically just however you can think of to approach individual situations with the guns, perks, etc. that are available to you at that moment. And the more you learn about the game, the easier that becomes. For instance, knowing where to find dynamite in Act 1 will basically let you kill just about any enemy that you face relatively easily if you can stealth up to them a little bit. Learning that it's easier to just grab the gold prospector perk to turn the economy in your favor and then start buying potions that will remove the curses from you, rather than doing a small side quest every time you get one to have it removed, goes a long way as well. So combat, much like the rest of this game, is surprisingly layered onto all of the other systems of the game, including even things down to inventory management, which require you to of course deal with how much ammo you have on you, what you're facing, what types of ammo do you need, etc. And I think making those minute-to-minute decisions about what you'll be facing, what you need to take, what you need to do to prepare, where would you like to go explore, what are you going to find there, things like that, are what make this game particularly compelling, to me at least. Add on to those things with a healthy dose of exploration and secrets to uncover, or little side quests to undertake that teach you a little more about what happened to an individual area, and it becomes a wonderfully layered experience that I think makes up for the game's other shortcomings, such as, again, that pretty terrible ending to the story. But with all of that said, let's move on to the Steam Deck section. Now, this game is definitely playable on Steam Deck, which is also its official Steam rating, and while it does have controller support and cloud saves, I think there's a few important things to know. One, the implementation of the controller support with this game is like a little bit wonky. For instance, it'll still bring up menus that you then have to like manually navigate with the controller icons rather than something a little more intuitive for that system. And while it's certainly workable, it's just a little bit clunky. Another issue I had in that regard is that I had to, for whatever reason on the Steam Deck, turn the look sensitivity up by like 5 times in order to get it to a decent place, as it was incredibly slow otherwise. And in general, games that involve a lot of precise aiming in certain situations, as headshots in this game can be pretty important, makes a controller a bit of a more difficult proposition, but otherwise it is very approachable. Obviously, graphics aren't too much of an issue. With the slightly more pixelated style here, the game isn't exactly graphically intensive, with most of your enjoyment to this on the Steam Deck probably coming down to fiddling with the controls a little bit, and much of the text and things in menus being very, very small on that already small screen. Otherwise, though, not bad at all. That does, however, bring us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. Now, for me, the positives is simply the gameplay. I think that portion of it, they nailed. Everything from the exploration to the combat itself, just moving around the world, learning about it, experiencing these large explorable areas in each chapter is a ton of fun, especially once you get to grips with how all the systems work. And while this is sort of rolled into that as gameplay is a bit of a broad term, I really did enjoy the exploration of this game, going to places off the beaten trail, exploring the map, and just finding cool and unique things out and about that way was a lot of fun for me personally. Now, on the negative side of things, as I mentioned, I think the story is a bit lackluster. The ending in particular, I think the rest of it is just okay, though admittedly the story was never exactly the cornerstone of what this game was about. Another negative is the slight pacing issue I mentioned, that stealth being important makes killing the enemy obviously important as well, but sometimes on the transition to a new act, you'll simply lack the damage to make that happen until you go track down some new weaponry that actually deals appropriate amounts of damage, combined with the appropriate ammo types, etc., to reliably kill something in a single hit from, for instance, stealth. And if you have trouble doing exactly that, you're probably going to die a lot, which is going to lead to curses, which will compound the issue and make the game generally harder on you, which I think could use some fine-tuning, frankly. All of which brings me to my conclusion. For $25 US at full price and whatever that amounts to regionally, I think Blood West offers a fairly compelling gameplay experience, both relying on stealth mechanics obviously, but also exploration that can be as either slow and steady as you want or a more high risk, high reward playstyle that I think makes the minute-to-minute gameplay of the game really something spectacular. But it does of course have those few problems that I outlined. Now personally, I'm willing to overlook those because of the scope of the game, the relatively cheap price, and the fact that I think the core of what Blood West is trying to do, it succeeds at quite handily. So all in all, a great game that won't break your wallet or eat up all your time. So naturally, that gets a buy from me, which is just about everything I've got to say on Blood West. So I certainly hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know down below how you feel about Blood West. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.